Reading today is taken from the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 5 through 26. So Jesus came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw." He said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You have correctly said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." The word of the Lord. This morning I have the privilege of introducing the person who is preaching this morning, and she happens to be my wife. I'm a smart aleck, just so you know, but I'm not going to be one right now. Kelly is the most provocative person that I know. We talk quite a bit. I don't know that she talks more than me, but when she talks, I tend to listen. Sometimes when I listen to Kelly, I listen so intently that she thinks I'm not listening. And so she'll say, "Are you listening?" And I'm saying, "I'm processing. I'm thinking about what you're talking about." And so much of my present perspective about God and how he works and how he works with me and how he views me has been shaped by her. And so it's my privilege to welcome my wife to come up and deliver the sermon this morning. And I think you're going to enjoy what she has to say. I'll be listening intently. Although I might be running back and forth because something probably is going wrong with the live stream or something.
I know, the technology has been iffy this morning. I do often think he's not listening. I think I just bumped it away from my mouth. I'm Kelly. If I haven't met you, come introduce yourself. And if you are unaware, I feel like everybody knows this, but I generally create the art that's in the sanctuary for each of the sermon series for the last couple of years. And so when we were talking about what we were going to do over the summer, actually, I got to have input in the summer that I normally don't have. Normally, about 2 months before we get to a new sermon series, I have nagged David and said, what are you going to be talking about? So I have time to think about it and stew a little bit. And this time, he was leaving and he wasn't thinking about it. And I knew we would have guests and Steve was going to fill in and whatever. And I happened to see these Fruit of the Spirit art prints. They were little. I've enlarged them and painted them. But I thought that's kind of a cool thing. And Steve had been talking about what it means to live into the resurrection, and you have the Holy Spirit, and the fruit of the Spirit would show itself in our life if we were living into the resurrection. And so we kind of all, David, Steve, and I came up with the summer kind of an idea. And so as we were doing that, Steve said, would you talk about worship and art one Sunday morning? So basically that's why I'm here. And when we read this passage, I want to especially focus on the last few verses. And just the idea of a conversation is going to kind of be a thread that will run through the things I'm going to talk about. But this conversation between Jesus and the woman, I feel like, have you talked to people where you feel like I'm talking over, like we're not connecting, we are talking and we're missing each other completely. I feel like that kind of is happening here. The woman has her own context. She lives in Samaria. Jews don't talk to us. And Jesus is speaking on a whole other level. And what he's saying, she's not cluing into, and you can kind of track it through the conversation. But particularly at the end, because I was going to talk about worship, I was focused in because the word comes up repeatedly here at the end. So she originally, and this is also what I do, if you know me well, I probably posed a question to you at one time or another about an upcoming sermon. I'll go, what do you visualize when you think of the Old Testament? Or I'll do that to try to get input from people so I can have an idea of what to do. I was doing that the last month with people with the word worship. What does it mean to you when I say the word worship? And for her, the obsession seems to be, the important part was where you did it. We worship on this mountain. And the Jews were like, no, you have to worship in Jerusalem. The location of where the worship took place was like key for them, which I would not think about in my context at all. And then when she asks Jesus that, his response is, time's coming when you won't worship on the mountain or in Jerusalem. He completely not part of the conversation. He just acts that part out. And then they go on and he said, you worship what you don't know, and the Jews worship what they know. And then he kind of negates that and said, but coming up, true worshipers will be kind of neither group. It'll be people who worship in spirit and in truth. And he just kind of keeps redefining what they've defined as worship. And then you can tell, in my estimation, because I would do this, that she's like, I am not cluing in with what you're saying, so I'm just going to change the conversation and say, I know the Messiah is coming, which seems like a statement totally out of the blue, because she's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Let me just change the topic. And he finally addresses directly what she said, and he says, yes, and I am he. And so this conversation, do you guys see it? Is it just me? Have you guys been in conversations where you went, we're not connecting? So looking at things that make conversation difficult, we'll just start there. Our presuppositions. We come to conversations with our own life experiences. I went and did a class this week with my granddaughters where we sculpted Snoopy. They had no idea who Snoopy was. They're 6 and 8, and they had a vague idea. They definitely didn't know who Woodstock was. And we did both, roasting marshmallows. They were clueless. So your context matters. Your life experience matters. Your gender matters. If you're an American or an Israeli matters. Like all of those things go into what we bring to a conversation, right? And our own experience, our own vocabulary. When I hang with Steve's family, I miss half of it because they'll resort to Russian at a key moment. And then when you'll say, I don't know that word, they'll say, it doesn't translate. I don't believe them. I think they're talking about me. Because it's generally a joke and they all laugh, but the joke's in Russian. So we have all of those things that come into conversations, our age, our experiences, our backgrounds, all of those things come into the conversation. And if we're not on the same page, even if I'm listening intently, I might miss what you're saying. I think that the woman was really listening to Jesus. I still think she was missing things because her context as a Samaritan woman was, these are the things that are important. Where I worship, these different things, and she's missing what he's saying. So listening is often the hardest part of having a conversation because we have a tendency to, in our brains, jump ahead maybe in what we're going to say or whatever. But it's also, I can be listening well and still miss your point. And I feel like that happens just in conversations. So we can all agree, you don't come to conversations in a vacuum. We bring all that we are. The other person brings all that they are to it. The same is true of worship. As I was thinking about it, I was intrigued by the connections between our worship experience and a conversation. Worship, in some ways, is like that. We come here and hope to commune with God, to make some kind of a connection. Maybe not a literal conversation, but we are praying and singing and all of that, and we're hoping that we will hear from the Spirit. Like we're hoping to have, maybe communion would be a better word than a flat-out conversation, but we're hoping to come here and have that kind of experience. We also, to complicate things further, because let's admit a conversation with God is complicated. His experience and perspective is not mine. And so we're coming together much like the Samaritan woman and Jesus and the conversation. We may be on different, we'll say for sure we're on different levels. But we also are coming together as a community. And each of you are bringing your past, your experiences, your hurts, your joys, your whatever has happened this week, this morning, and so am I. And we're going to try to all come together in one building and have a conversation with God as a group, which now has complicated things further. So all of our backgrounds enter into our worship experience. Also, what we may not think about is our vocabulary is different. So when I say worship, what do you mean by worship? We all might have a different definition. For some of us, I think we get caught on things like the Samaritan woman. We are like, worship is singing hymns. Worship is singing worship songs. Worship is when I have a guitar and I clap and I have an emotional experience. Worship is when the sermon is great and the word is explained clearly. We could all have a different definition. When we get here this morning, our expectations are all different. And when we go out on the patio, we say, worship was really good this morning. Or we get in the car, save it for the car, not for the coffee hour, and say, that really sucked. I didn't enjoy worship this morning. The sermon, I totally missed the point. Don't say that either. Say, I got it. I know what Kelly was talking about. So when we come to worship, our experiences affect it and how we even define what we're expecting to get out of the experience. Now, I had an interesting conversation this past week with my son Tim and his wife, Jessica. Jessica normally is up here with worship. They're away for their anniversary this weekend, so I don't have to worry about talking in front of Tim, who is my worst critic, kind of. But her dad did his doctorate in worship and music. And so I asked him, how would you define worship? And he said, and he had a lot to say, as you could imagine. But he brought up something that never would have occurred to me. He said, did you know that the vast majority of times the word worship is used in the Bible, it means kneeling or prostrating oneself? That's like 66 times. 6 times it has to do with knowledge. There's a couple times it has to do with other things, but mostly it means to kneel or prostrate oneself. It's a physical, when they were talking about worship, what? We need to practice this word? Oh, we did practice, and I messed it up. I apologize. Anyway, so if you missed that, good. But I don't think of kneeling when I think of worship. Do any of you think of kneeling? Those of you with a Catholic background might. But when we walk into a Catholic church and see kneelers, for some of us, we might go, oh, that's not part of my experience. I don't bring that. But it was an interesting thing to me, and I thought maybe I should think about that more. What position my body takes if I'm sitting, standing, kneeling. I know a lot of Russians, they pray standing. And I thought that was so odd. When we would say grace, everyone would stand. And I thought, that's weird. But physically, how you arrange your body can affect your spirit. I mean, we are all one thing, body and spirit, so it makes sense. But it had never occurred to me until I was talking to Doug, and I went, okay, I have to think about that a little bit. So the conversation that is worship is multi-layered, is what I'm saying. Our backgrounds, what we're expecting, what language we use. Also, I think for some of us, it's the singing that's key. For some of us, it's the teaching time. And we think of it not as a conversation, but more like I'm giving a speech, and I'm the one who gets to impart things, and you have to listen to me. We were in the car once. We have 4 sons, and they were little. And one of the boys asked, what do you guys do in big church? Which is what they called this, as opposed to Sunday school. And they said, do you just talk? Because evidently he thought there was way too much talking going on in his class that morning. And I said, no, Caleb, we just listen to your dad talk. And he thought about that, and he said, I'm going to be a pastor when I grow up because I want to be the one talking. And he is. So evidently being in church and having to listen was not on his agenda. But that is a really false picture of what it means to give a speech or a lecture or a sermon, because the listening part is you are as much a participant right now as I am speaking. We normally go from church to our life group, and it's interesting when we get there and we have a conversation about the service, we've all picked up different things. Based on where place we were at, we heard David say, David said the exact same words to all of us, and I didn't hear that, or I got this out of it. Your listening during someone speaking is an active participation of what's actually happening, because if you weren't listening and just left, there was no conversation, no communication. The listening part, when someone is giving a speech, is just as critical to the understanding, even if you're not actually responding in speech, but your ability to listen and hear what's being said and then to be able to discuss it. So I try to, when I go to hear a sermon or a speech, realize I'm an active participant in this. I need to be trying to pay attention and understand what they're saying. So what does all of that have to do with the art that's in the sanctuary? Art is also a conversation between the artist and the viewer. It's complicated because we don't all speak the language of art. And so we it's not tools that most of us are given, just in general. When I would teach a lot of art history classes. Art history is really my thing, not creating art. I love art history. And for the record, I have no training in anything having to do with art. I just am obsessed and read about it a lot. So feel free to correct me. If you know something that I am misrepresenting, I'm more than happy to learn. But art history is so fascinating because I can go look at a piece from an African tribesman to a Hindu carving to a medieval altarpiece to a modern art piece at the MoMA or whatever. And that artist is speaking directly to me, and it's fascinating. The thing is, I'm curious now how many of you are with me. I gravitate toward art I understand. And so I've had to really educate myself more, and I'm still a long ways off on modern art because I don't know that language as well. And so I know that the artist was trying to communicate something, and I feel like I'm like the Samaritan woman, and I'm missing the message. And so I try to learn more before I dismiss out of hand. But have any of you had the experience of walking into an art museum and just going, like you spend 2 minutes at this picture and 2 minutes, and then you kind of in your head go, I like that one, don't like that one, but you kind of can zip through the art museum. I feel like that's a fairly universal experience, and it's because we don't speak the language of art. And so in order to have a conversation with a piece, you have to learn a bit of the language. In art, that's going to be color and line and perspective and symbolism, particularly symbolism. If we know those things, then all of a sudden I can stand and look at a piece for 10 minutes because it's saying a lot. And so I have this conversation with the art piece. But again, I bring what I bring to it, my context as a modern person living in America, and the artist brought their context, symbols, all of who they are to it. And if I don't know some of that, I might appreciate it and go, oh my gosh, I could never have done that. I can look at ancient Greek sculptures and go, how the heck did they do that without modern tools? Cathedrals are mind-boggling when you consider just what it took to create it. But I don't get all of what they were saying and doing with that until I dig deeper. So when I get a topic and David says, could you create some art around this sermon topic? I generally go to art history, I save a bunch of stuff, and I try to find something that intrigues me that I can bring into the sanctuary. This is why I normally, if you go in the bulletins, write up a explanation kind of my journey and how I created it and what I was thinking, so that we can engage a bit more about the art that's in the sanctuary. Because otherwise, people walk in and go, this is pretty, I like the colors. And that's totally valid, and I try to do things seasonally, and I want it to be aesthetically pleasing and to fit the space. But I try to layer meaning on. So it's kind of like, if Lisa could put up the pilgrim, it's kind of like this piece. I made a mosaic a few months ago that was because David was going to talk about pilgrimage. And so you could come in and go, that's cool. She has backpackers in a mosaic. I like it. And that's kind of the Samaritan woman. I'm worshiping at the mountain, whatever. If you had gone and read what I wrote up about it, you would say, I liked the idea of the pilgrimage being made out of broken tile pieces. I literally ordered tile, took a hammer to it, and broke it apart. So I had broken pieces that came together to make a picture. Feels like our lives and our journey with God we're broken pieces that he manages to glue back together and actually make something. I like the fact that they were going uphill. I'm going toward God. I like the fact there were 3 of them. I didn't want someone alone on the journey. We're not alone. There's pilgrims that have gone before us, ones that are coming after us, and we're together on the journey. I like that they had backpacks. You may not be able to tell these details from the pieces I broke, but this is a long journey. So if you had gone and read that, you might have come in on Sunday morning and gone, as David's talking, I have visually new elements have been brought into the conversation that is worship. It's not just what's being said or sung, but visually, I now have more thoughts to throw into the conversation. Does that make sense? So that's generally what I'm doing when I'm creating art for the sanctuary, is trying to add supplemental elements, new pieces to the puzzle, that when you come and you're sitting here before or during music, you have other things to think about, contemplate, and go, how does this fit into what we're learning about this month or this season during the church? And how can it expand what I know about God and about my journey, and particularly right now about what it means to live into the resurrection. So that brings me to the art that is actually in the sanctuary right now. And I'm going to start talking with the windows, which probably feel like an afterthought, and they're kind of where the key is. I saw these pieces and did some more research on Matisse. Matisse is a really popular artist, but he's odd, which all artists are so fascinating. And he was an avant-garde artist who worked from the late 1800s through 1950s. So he had this massively long career. So you have him going through all kinds of stages of art. He started in what was pretty traditional, we think of Impressionists, and then he saw some Van Goghs, and he went to what is up in the sanctuary, in these up here, into the weird uses of color. They're not meant to be realistic. They're flattened. The perspective is off. All of that he became quite fascinated by, and he started doing more of that. Then he kept following that line along until at the end of his life, he went, I've gone as far as I can go with painting and this idea. I'm going to just start cutting out pieces of paper. And he painted paper, and then he would just freehand cut shapes with these giant scissors. If you go look at him, I'm sorry, I don't understand how he got those scissors to go anywhere he wanted them to. They look like, it was kind of crazy. And he started doing cutouts. And then in his apartment, he would just plaster these cutouts on the wall. They were huge works. And then when he got everything where he wanted it, he would then transfer them onto these giant canvases. And you can go see some of Matisse's cutouts. Not all of them are massive, but he went to, so now we're talking really flat shapes. At the very end of his life, he had a severe kind of intestinal cancer. And the woman who he hired to be his nurse was a young woman who eventually became a nun. And after she had left his employ when he was recovering, they ended up living in the same neighborhood and reconnected. And she was telling him that the place where they worshiped was an old leaky garage. And he's like, we should build a chapel. And he was, at this time, he would have said he was an atheist, but when you read his words, I doubt it. I think he thought, I don't know what he thought, but he said, I meet God when I'm working. And he told her, you don't need to take a calling to be a nun. I have experienced God in his light. And he talks about it, and you go, you got it. You just didn't like the label of I'm a this or I'm a that. But he had when I read his works, I go, he had a genuine connection with God. And he designs a chapel. And in the chapel, he makes a tree of life stained glass window at the front of the chapel. And these are inspired by that. I actually tried to recreate them, and I'd have been here till Christmas trying to do it. So I gave up, and we went with this. But the leaves are the exact replicas of what was in his tree of life. And you'll notice that they're up here and they're in this. These yellow leaves kind of weave through everything. And that's because when I go to art history, there are a couple things that are always in resurrection ideas. One of them is trees. This is Renaissance medieval artists. because they used a lot of symbols. And what they would do is they always tried to tie the garden to the cross, to the resurrection, to the next coming of Christ. And one of the ways they connected all of that was with the trees. So they said, we have in the garden, we have 2 trees. And they called the one the tree of disobedience. That's the one they ate from. And then you have the tree of life there in the garden, right? And then there was a belief that the cross that Christ died on was actually made from the wood of the tree that Adam and Eve ate off of. It's quite a leap, but there you go. And that the cross is actually stuck in the ground over the skull of Adam. I'm just telling you what these artists thought. I am not promoting this theory. But they used the tree from the garden as the cross was the tree of obedience. So we have the tree of disobedience, and then Christ dying on the cross was the tree of obedience. And then we have the tree of life in the garden, and we have the tree of life in resurrection, in Revelation. In Revelation 22, it says, "Then the angel showed me the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer would anything be accursed, but the throne of God and the Lamb will be it." So they've taken the tree of life from the garden, put it in John's Revelation, and said, this tree will bring healing to the nations, this tree of life. So Matisse put the tree of life at the front of this chapel that he built. And so I have connected obviously we're talking about resurrection and what it means to live into the resurrection, that the tree of life brings healing to the nations, to individuals, to communities, to churches. And so I decided to take the leaves and actually put them on the cross, because the tree of life is intimately connected to the idea of Christ coming to the earth, being incarnate. And so we've connected those. And I've connected them to this over here. Now, the second theme that's always in all of these kind of art things is the idea of a garden. Obviously, we have the Garden of Eden. We have the Garden of Gethsemane. We have throughout the Bible, if you just track the gardens, it's fascinating. But most Renaissance medieval artists didn't really know how to paint the resurrection. We're not given a good physical description of what happened. So they generally paint the crucifixion, maybe the body coming down or him being buried, but they paint the aftermath when the women come, and often it's Mary Magdalene and Jesus' encounter. And what does she mistake him for? A gardener. And if you look at a lot of those old paintings, he's actually carrying a shovel or a hoe and wearing a gardener's hat. There's a connect to Jesus is the gardener. He's taken what happened in Eden and he's fixed it in the resurrection picture. We now have this new garden. And we have the link with Mary is almost always painted for the Annunciation and the coming of Christ in a walled garden, because we're connecting her. She's the middle ground between the Garden of Eden. Eve was the first Eve. Mary is the second Eve. Where the first Eve failed, the second Eve brought healing to the nations. And she's in this garden, and now we'll see the final garden. Where are you seeing the connect? So one of Matisse's most famous works is The Parakeet and the Mermaid, which has nothing to do with what I'm saying. But I took that idea and made this. So the idea was lots of his leaves to create a lush garden. And within it, you have to look for them. We have the doves of the Spirit, and we have people resurrected, leaping for joy in that center panel. So we have a resurrection life in a garden that has now been brought back to life by the gardener, by Christ. So we have the themes of the trees, the garden, and the green. There was green all around because, as I think Steve talked about it one week, green is liturgically the color of the ordinary times, which I just love that term, ordinary times. It's not Lent, it's not Advent, it's not one of the liturgical seasons, it's the ordinary, it's the in-between times. And it was decided that the color that would symbolize that would be green, because green is signs of life, indicates growth in faith, hope in the resurrection, vibrant health, and strength. And so we have the green, which we all kind of associate with lush gardens, trees in bloom, all that kind of thing. And they're all rooted in God. And so we come back to the tree being rooted in God, the gardens, the greenery being rooted. All of that to say, and then the fruits of the Spirit, connecting to the doves up here. If we're living into resurrection life and the promise of the garden and the tree of life, we're going to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. Those are all going to be evident in our life the more we ground ourselves in that. So anyway, those were the thoughts going through my head as I created the decor for this season of the church. So for me, if we return to the original idea of a conversation, I see worship and art as an intersection of that conversation and bringing a new element, a new vocabulary into it, and adding visual elements. Art can help us to listen and respond to the voice of God in a way that maybe other things don't, or a different way, an additional way. And we're to worship with heart, mind, strength, soul, a whole of man. And so bringing in the visual can be really helpful. And I'm going to finish with this quote by William Temple, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury during World War II, just after. Not a great time, probably. But he said, "Worship is a submission of all our nature to God. It is the quickening of conscience by his holiness, the nourishment of mind with his truth, the purifying of imagination by his beauty, the opening of the heart to his love, the surrender of will to his purpose,